community in North America. And I want to start by talking about some of these terms. So resilience, I usually teach world music from the perspective and framing of cultural sustainability and environmental sustainability. And so resilience is this idea that a community, a music culture has the ability to successfully cope with a crisis, the ability to recover, and not just recover, sometimes even come back stronger. So it has these sometimes problematic narratives of overcoming adversity. And then in terms of social justice, we're going to be talking about Tanya Tagaq and her intercultural collaborations with the Kronos Quartet and her use of the stage and social media as an opportunity to communicate social justice that pertains to the Indigenous community in North America. And for her, social justice has a lot to do with the idea of retribution, the idea of payback, a form of revenge, of vengeance for wrongdoings against the Indigenous community. And particularly she comes from, she's Inuk and comes from the Inuit communities in northern Canada, what we now know as Canada. And I'll have a few maps to kind of geographically position us on that. And then this overarching idea of Indigenous modernity, we're looking at this application of the concept of modernity, which we typically look at from a North American, Western, white settler colonial perspective. And many Indigenous performers today are thinking about modernity from an Indigenous point of view, that there's many different ways of being modern in the 21st century, and that progress and process, there's not one way of being progressive, there's not one way of being modern. And if you're coming from one of these Indigenous communities, your idea of progress and process in the world and ways of being modern might be very different from an urban perspective as a white North American, say, living in New York City. And so for Tanya Tagaq, this comes through in a lot of her creation practices, but in a lot of her intercultural collaborations that she engages in. And so what we're going to be looking at today is an instance of Indigenous modernity where Tanya Tagaq, as well as other Indigenous practitioners, are adopting musical and stylistic features from popular culture and other traditionally non-Indigenous genres of music and indigenizing them in different ways. So another instance of this that I use in my world music classroom and also in my North American Indigenous cultures class is the idea of hip hop being mixed with Inuit throat singing. So it's called a form of throat boxing that takes place in urban centers in the north. And it's this fusion of hip hop cultures and throat singing as we'll hear it today, and to create a new kind of hybridized form that indigenizes the traditionally non-Indigenous genre of hip hop. So I want you to think about the different ways in which modernity, but hybridity and taking on musical and aesthetic features of other cultures and other types of musical practices are being infused into Inuit throat singing in its iteration as we'll hear today. So I wanted to start with a bit of an icebreaker, but a way to get us thinking about this music, which I'm assuming you might have heard a little bit of its sound in some instances in popular culture, but don't necessarily have a lot of prior knowledge going into the class today. So what I've curated here for you today is a sound clip that we'll listen to. This is an image of Tanya Tagaq from her promotional material, and a quote from Tanya Tagaq talking about hearing and living the land I want you to read through. And on the blank side of the piece of paper that I've handed out to you, I want you to write down what you notice from these three cultural texts in dialogue with each other, and what are you wondering just off the top of your head. And I'll play the clip for you now, which is from the track Fracking from her 2014 album Animism. Okay, so just write down what your first, what do you notice, what do you wonder based on that sound clip, but also the image and the text. I'll just step back just in case you can see it from the left and right hand side. Just give you a couple of moments to think. And then once you finish what you're writing, we're going to pass them around the class so you can kind of read off what other people were thinking about this first exposure to Tandy Gap's musical practice. It might take you to kind of get up over the chairs to kind of pass around the sheets. So just finish off your sentence. It doesn't have to be long, just initial impressions. Okay. So when you're ready, pass the sheets of paper around a few times to people so you don't have your original sheet of paper and you're looking at someone else's response. And then once you receive the piece of paper, take a look at what you're reading now. Okay, so just look at what you're reading now, and then any volunteers to share what the piece of paper that you're reading from and a comment from another one of your classmates. Yes?
I noticed the building background and the overarching expression of pain.
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of emotional build up through the music, but also the texture over the course of that particular clip from Fracking. Anyone else?
Oh, you want me to read
What does yours say? Yeah, I will start choosing.
She uses full ability of her vocal cords and respiration to get the message across.
Yeah, so a lot of building, breath, the idea of breath will be coming back to. Here's on the t-shirt. What does yours say? Since I don't know anyone's names.
This is clearly a very angry, distressed woman.
So we got anger and pain, yeah, and breathing. 30 seconds. I can't read through.
30 seconds.
Yeah. There's also the art of reading other people's handwriting.
Can't really read it. Can you come back to me? When
Oh
I
yeah,
know what it says?
to throw it away. Red and gray laptop. Yes.
It says it sounds very scary and bold, and it seems dark in the picture, and it goes along with that.
Yeah, so there's a sense of darkness, yes. Anyone for the front, Martin teacher?
I noticed that her voice to me sounds like she is being tortured / and then there's a lot of stuff that's written like that's really loud.
Okay. Some revision, yes. Okay, and over here, anyone from the side can participate? Giovanni.
I guess it sounds belong in a horror film.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And there's certain kind of genre characteristics that we latch on based on the way in which she's using her voice in this instance. And this is a very current iteration of Tandy Jack's use of throat singing that you'll hear sounds very different from the traditional throat singing that we're going to start off with in class. So keep some of those thoughts in mind, plus those who didn't read from their sheets, what's on the sheet. We can also come back if you're still decoding the handwriting over the course of the class. And so I want you to think about some of those oral and visual images that were coming to you in your own listening experience, but also the listening experience of others in the classroom. You heard some overlap in the ideas and how we were coming to this for the first time. So, yeah, we don't need to listen to it again. So I want to start off with this map. And so this is from Rudy Weeb's book, Plain Dead, Contemplation Concerning the Arctic from 1989. And in this book, and this map, Inuit View to the South, it's from an entire volume that's talking about northern experiences from an Indigenous Inuit perspective. And the whole book, as well as this map, is about repositioning ourselves to listen, to think about the North from a northern perspective instead of where typically a southern perspective. And so if you're looking at this map, you'll see that it's an optical reversal. That it's been completely flipped upside down. The North Pole is located at the bottom of the map instead of the south, the north of the map, at the top of the map. We have Canada up at the top of the map where we normally would see it positioned at the bottom. And Rudy Weave's idea is that this is the way in which Indigenous populations and communities look at the world and how they approach the rest of the landmass and the continent from their spatial and cultural perspective. But what I find particularly interesting about this map is that it also critiques the polyfocal narrative and history of the North through the histories of colonization, northern expansion, but also Cold War politics. And as you'll see, there's a combination of different naming practices on this map where we don't normally see these naming practices on the same map. So we have here King William and Inuvik to point at. So in this instance, he's also trying to represent a polyvocal representation of the North that captures both the Indigenous histories and naming practices of the North from an Inuit perspective, such as in Inuvik, but he also uses the naming practices of settler colonialism in kind of North American history through the retention of King William as one of kind of the settled fur trading centers of the North. And he's using this mapping practice in his book to really critique the way in which we view the North and how we listen to it from a Southern perspective, because we were listening to Tanny Degat's practice largely from a Southern settler perspective. And when we look at maps, they're normally positioned from a Southern perspective of that of the map, colonial map maker rather than the actual community member. So that's something to start off thinking about. And then the second map is a map that you can actually access on nativeland.ca, and it represents the various different cultural Indigenous groups across North America. And as you can see, the ways in which they overlap, the way that they're spatialized on the map, overlap, sometimes adhere to, but largely don't, the kind of provincial and federal and state territories that we normally think of how the landmass is segmented up and how we think of states and provinces and territories across North America. And if you go to this website, you can actually pick and choose which parts of the North American continent you want to focus in on, look at how different Indigenous groups overlap with each other, because it isn't the sense of they only fall within this particular state or this particular territory. There's overlap within provincial and federal territory boundaries. But what I like about this map is that it also problematizes the way in which we study Indigenous cultures in North America. That we can't think of these as American cultural traditions or Canadian cultural traditions. There's so much cultural overlap that takes place. And in particular, we're looking at Inuit throat singing today. And so historically, the Inuit are located primarily in northern Canada, but there are also segments of the population across northern Alaska, but also Greenland. But the primary population that we're looking at today is focused in and around the Northwest Territories and what is now the territory of Nunavut in Canada, and what we now know as Canada. And so you can play around with looking at this map to see how maps and borders can really be problematized if we think beyond kind of North American systems of kind of geography and demarcating land today. And so in a lot of Indigenous music histories, we can't really necessarily think about it in terms of we're studying Canadian music or we're studying American music, because we're looking at cultures that pre-existed before these national boundaries were established, if we look beyond and before settler colonialism. And so we're looking here at the traditional territory of the Inuit, But Tanya Tagaq herself has moved around throughout her life. She was born in Cambridge Bay and then has moved throughout Canada in her life and tours internationally. So Inuit throat singing, to pull up an image and some points about it, is traditionally performed by two women in the home as a vocal game. And it's a vocal game to pass time.